The relationship has operated according to a predictable pattern where the avoidant withdraws and you pursue, where they create distance and you work to bridge it, where they maintain a defended position while you provide all the relational labor that keeps the connection alive. This dynamic has given the avoidant complete control because your consistent pursuit meant they never faced genuine consequence for their withdrawal. They never had to choose whether they wanted the relationship because your effort maintained it regardless of their investment. They never experienced what losing you would actually feel like because you remained accessible despite their patterns. The avoidant could withdraw knowing you would be there when they decided to briefly return. They could maintain minimal investment while benefiting from your maximum effort. They could have a relationship without the vulnerability that genuine participation would require. Then the pattern shifts in ways that destabilize everything the avoidant has relied upon. You stop pursuing, you cease bridging the distance they create, you withdraw your effort and investment, redirecting that energy toward yourself and your own life. The avoidant experiences your withdrawal as a temporary tantrum, as a strategic move designed to make them chase you, as a performance that will end once you realize it is not generating the desired response. Yet days become weeks, weeks become months, and you maintain your silence with a consistency that eventually forces the avoidant to recognize you have not paused pursuit, but have ended it entirely. Simultaneously, the avoidant maintains their silence, telling themselves they are simply giving you space, that they are respecting your apparent need for distance, that they are maintaining appropriate boundaries by not pursuing you. The mutual silence that results flips the entire dynamic because neither person is actively maintaining the connection. Neither is pursuing the other. Neither is working to bridge the distance. For the first time in the relationship, the avoidant faces that connection will only exist if they actively choose it and demonstrate that choice through vulnerable pursuit they have spent their life avoiding. The game flips because the avoidant discovers that all their power derived from your willingness to pursue them, that their defended position only worked because you compensated for their withdrawal, that they must now do what they have never done, actively choose and pursue intimate connection, accept the permanent loss of a relationship they took for granted. The power dynamic completely reverses. The avoidant has held all power throughout the relationship through their comfort with distance, their willingness to withdraw, their ability to remain emotionally disconnected while you remained invested. This power manifested in countless ways. The avoidant decided when contact occurred because you accommodated their unavailability. The avoidant determined the relationship's emotional temperature because you adjusted yourself to their defended comfort level. The avoidant controlled the pace and depth of intimacy because you accepted whatever limited access they offered. The power derived specifically from the asymmetry where you needed the connection more than they did, where you worked harder to maintain the relationship, where you feared loss more than they feared vulnerability. This power structure depended entirely on your continued pursuit. When you pursued despite their withdrawal, when you bridged the distance they created, when you maintained hope despite their patterns, you confirmed the avoidance power by demonstrating that their withdrawal generated your increased effort. The avoidant learned that creating distance made you work harder to restore closeness, that their unavailability increased your investment, that withholding presence made you more grateful for their occasional engagement. This dynamic gave the avoidant a perfect setup. They could remain defended while you did all the vulnerable work of maintaining connection. They could control intimacy through their withdrawal while you remained powerless to create closeness they refused to provide. When you stop pursuing and maintain genuine silence, the entire power structure collapses instantly. The avoidance power derived from your willingness to pursue, and that willingness has disappeared. The avoidant can no longer control the dynamic through withdrawal because withdrawal now produces actual distance rather than your compensatory pursuit. The avoidant discovers that their comfort with distance only provided power when someone was uncomfortable with distance and working to eliminate it. Once you match their comfort with distance, once you demonstrate equal or greater willingness to maintain silence, the avoidant's primary source of control evaporates. The power reversal becomes complete when the avoidant recognizes that connection now depends entirely on their choice to pursue. Throughout the relationship, connection existed because you maintained it through your effort. The avoidant could passively receive relationship benefits without actively choosing them because your pursuit created connection regardless of their investment. The mutual silence eliminates this passive receipt of relationship. If the avoidant wants connection, they must actively pursue it. They must reach out first. They must demonstrate vulnerability by showing they want contact. They must risk rejection by making their desire for connection visible. The avoidant faces that all the vulnerable positions they avoided throughout the relationship, pursuing, risking rejection, demonstrating need, have now become required if they want the relationship to exist at all. This reversal terrifies the avoidant in ways your previous pursuit never did. When you pursued, the avoidant could maintain a defended position while experiencing your care and investment. They could feel desired without having to demonstrate desire. They could receive without having to give. They could remain protected while you remained exposed. The mutual silence eliminates all these defended comforts. The avoidant must now become the pursuer if they want connection. They must demonstrate investment they have avoided showing. They must make themselves vulnerable in ways they have spent their life preventing. The power has completely reversed because the avoidant discovers that maintaining a defended position now costs them the relationship entirely, rather than simply keeping you at a manageable distance. The avoidant also loses the power to manipulate your emotional state through their availability. Throughout the relationship, the avoidant could affect your emotions dramatically through small changes in their engagement, offering slightly more presence to restore your hope, creating more distance to increase your pursuit, providing occasional warmth to keep you invested. Your emotional state responded to their behavioral adjustments, giving them power to regulate your experience through their strategic availability. The mutual silence eliminates this power entirely. The avoidant cannot affect your emotional state when you are not in contact. They cannot use their presence or absence to manipulate your responses. They cannot regulate your investment through their strategic engagement. You have removed yourself from their sphere of influence, placing yourself beyond their capacity to affect. The power reversal creates particular discomfort because the avoidant must face that they need the relationship more than their defended ego can tolerate. Acknowledging the avoidant self-concept has incorporated the belief that they are the less invested party, the one who could take or leave the relationship, the person who values independence over connection. The mutual silence, where you maintain your distance as comfortably as they maintain theirs, forces a devastating recognition. Perhaps you were never the more dependent one, but rather the more generous one. Perhaps you were not needier, but more willing to invest in connection. Perhaps the avoidance defended position masked greater need than your open pursuit ever revealed. The avoidant faces that if they want the relationship, they must acknowledge and act on need, a need their defensive structure exists to prevent them from recognizing. The reversal also eliminates the avoidant's ability to maintain the illusion of control while avoiding accountability. Throughout the relationship, the avoidant could tell themselves they were maintaining appropriate boundaries, giving necessary space, protecting a legitimate need for autonomy. Your pursuit allowed these rationalizations because the relationship continued despite their withdrawal. The mutual silence forces recognition that their withdrawal was not healthy boundary maintenance, but rather was defensive avoidance that has now cost them the relationship. The avoidant cannot maintain that their patterns were justified when those patterns have produced an outcome they do not actually want. If they desire connection, they must acknowledge their patterns created its absence rather than maintained healthy limits. Understanding this power reversal requires recognizing that the avoidant built their entire relational approach on a foundation of others' pursuit. Their defended position only worked because someone else compensated for their withdrawal. Their emotional unavailability only felt sustainable because someone else provided the emotional labor. Their comfort with distance only functioned as a relational strategy because someone else was uncomfortable enough with distance to eliminate it. When you stop pursuing, when you match their silence, when you demonstrate equal or greater comfort with disconnection, the avoidant's entire strategy collapses and power shifts completely to whoever can sustain the silence longer, whoever actually needs the connection less, whoever can genuinely thrive in the absence of contact. The avoidant discovers that this person is now you. The avoidant loses their safety net for the first time. The avoidant has navigated their entire relational life with an invisible safety net. They never consciously acknowledged it, but unconsciously depended upon the belief that others would remain available despite the avoidant's withdrawal. That return would always be possible when the avoidant decided they wanted connection, that their patterns might frustrate people but would not result in permanent loss. This safety net allowed the avoidant to withdraw without facing genuine risk, to maintain a defended position without experiencing actual consequences, to prioritize their defended comfort, knowing that others' attachment to them would survive periods of distance or emotional unavailability. The avoidant operated with confidence that they could leave and return at will, that access to people who cared about them remained secure regardless of how they behaved. This safety net specifically manifested in the avoidant's relationship with you through their unconscious awareness that you would remain accessible. The avoidant could withdraw knowing you would be there when they returned. They could create distance confident that you would bridge it. They could offer minimal investment secure in the knowledge that you would maintain the relationship through your excessive effort. This unconscious security meant the avoidant never truly risked losing you even during their most extreme withdrawal, because your consistent pursuit demonstrated that your attachment survived their patterns. The avoidant could be as unavailable as their defenses demanded because the safety net of your continued availability meant they never faced a genuine threat of permanent loss. When you stop contacting them and maintain sustained silence, the safety net disappears for the first time. The avoidant faces that you may not remain available, that return may not be possible if they wait too long, that their patterns may have finally generated permanent rather than temporary consequence. This elimination of safety creates fear. The avoidant has successfully avoided throughout their defended life the possibility that they could lose someone who matters to them, not through that person's choice to leave, but through the avoidant's own patterns creating distance that eventually becomes unbridgeable. The avoidant must confront that their defensive structure does not protect them from loss, but rather creates the very loss they organize their life around preventing. The loss of the safety net also forces the avoidant to recognize that your availability was a gift rather than a guarantee. Throughout the relationship, the avoidant treated your presence as a baseline they could depend upon, as a given that required no maintenance or reciprocation. The avoidant assumed you would always be there because you had always been there, because your pursuit had been so consistent that the avoidant could not imagine you actually stopping. The mutual silence reveals that your availability was not guaranteed, but was rather a choice you made repeatedly to remain invested, despite the avoidance patterns. Now that you have stopped making that choice, the avoidant faces that what they took as a permanent fixture was actually a sustained gift that has been withdrawn. This recognition that your availability was a gift they took for granted generates a particular form of panic in the avoidant. They face that they had access to someone who cared deeply, who offered patience most people would never provide, who maintained investment despite receiving minimal reciprocation, and they failed to adequately value or reciprocate that gift while it was available. The avoidant now watches that gift being withdrawn, recognizes its value only after losing access to it, understands too late that they should have treated your availability as precious rather than as guaranteed. The panic stems from the recognition that they squandered something irreplaceable through their failure to recognize its value while they had it. The absence of the safety net also eliminates the avoidant's ability to maintain comfortable defended distance. Throughout the relationship, the avoidant could withdraw to whatever distance felt comfortable because they knew unconsciously that the relationship would survive their withdrawal. The safety net meant the avoidant never had to manage the tension between their defended comfort and their desire for connection, because your pursuit meant they could have both. They could be as distant as their defenses demanded while still maintaining the relationship through your effort. The disappearance of the safety net forces the avoidant to choose between defended comfort and actual connection, because they can no longer have both simultaneously. Maintaining defended distance now means losing the relationship entirely. The avoidant experiences the loss of the safety net as disorienting because they have never navigated relationships without it. The avoidant has spent their entire relational life with unconscious confidence that people would tolerate their patterns, that access would remain open despite their withdrawal, that they could maintain a defended position without permanent cost. This confidence shaped every relational choice the avoidant made, allowing patterns that would have generated immediate consequences in other people's relationships to continue indefinitely in the avoidant's connections. Without the safety net, the avoidant must suddenly navigate relationships the way others do, recognizing that patterns have consequences, that withdrawal risks permanent loss, that maintaining connection requires actual effort rather than simply receiving the effort others provide. The panic the avoidant experiences when recognizing the safety net has disappeared often manifests as impulses to reach out that get immediately suppressed by the defensive structure still attempting to maintain control. The avoidant wants to contact you to verify that access remains possible, to test whether the safety net still exists, to confirm that they have not actually lost you permanently. Yet, the avoidance defenses prevent acting on these impulses because reaching out would require admitting they need the relationship, would demonstrate vulnerability they still cannot tolerate, would reveal that losing you matters more than maintaining their defended position. The avoidant experiences an internal war between panic about losing the safety net and defensive resistance to showing the vulnerability that acknowledging that panic would require. Understanding that the avoidant has lost their safety net requires recognizing that this represents a genuinely new experience for someone whose entire relational life has operated with unconscious confidence that others' availability was secure. The avoidant is facing for the first time the possibility that their patterns could cost them permanent access to someone who matters, that their defensive structure could create loss they cannot reverse, that their withdrawal could finally push someone beyond their willingness to remain available. This recognition creates a psychological crisis the avoidant has no practice mechanisms for managing because the safety net's presence has prevented them from ever developing the capacity to navigate relationships where their patterns generate genuine rather than merely theoretical risk of permanent loss. The psychological pressure that builds in sustained mutual silence. The avoidant initially experiences mutual silence as relief, as a welcome absence of pressure that your pursuit created, as a restoration of defended comfort that your consistent presence threatened. The avoidant tells themselves that the silence feels good, that they are enjoying the space, that they are content without contact. This initial period confirms the avoidant's defensive narrative that they prefer solitude to connection, that your pursuit was a burden they are glad to be free from, that maintaining silence proves they do not need the relationship as much as you needed it. The avoidant settles into the silence with a satisfaction that mirrors the relief they typically feel when creating distance. Yet as days extend into weeks and weeks extend into months, the quality of the silence shifts in ways the avoidant did not anticipate. The relief transforms gradually into something heavier, more uncomfortable, more difficult to dismiss as simply enjoying space. The avoidant begins experiencing the silence as weight rather than as freedom, as an absence that feels increasingly wrong rather than as a distance that provides comfort. This shift occurs slowly enough that the avoidant does not consciously recognize when their experience of the silence changed. Yet the discomfort builds with accumulating intensity that eventually cannot be ignored or rationalized away. The psychological pressure emerges partly from the avoidant's growing awareness that the silence is not a temporary pause, but rather appears to be a permanent state. The avoidant expected that you would eventually break the silence, that your attachment would override your boundaries, that your need for connection would drive you to reach out. As time passes without any contact from you, the avoidant must face that you are not pausing, but rather have genuinely stopped, that you are not strategically withdrawing, but have authentically redirected your life away from them. This recognition that the silence may never end unless the avoidant breaks, it creates pressure the avoidant has never experienced because their patterns have always involved temporary distance, followed by others' pursuit, rather than sustained mutual disconnection. The pressure intensifies as the avoidant recognizes they are missing information about your life and well-being. The avoidant wonders how you are doing, whether you think about them, whether you have moved on, whether you are involved with someone new. These questions create persistent background anxiety because the avoidant has no way to answer them during sustained silence. The avoidant cannot know whether you miss them or have completely released them, whether you would be receptive to contact or would reject any attempt at reconnection. This uncertainty about your internal state and current circumstances creates pressure that grows more uncomfortable as the silence extends because the avoidant's imagination fills the void with scenarios that increase their anxiety. The avoidant also experiences pressure from the growing recognition that maintaining the silence requires them to actively suppress impulses to reach out. Early in the mutual silence, the avoidant suppresses occasional impulses without much difficulty. As time passes, the impulses become more frequent and more intense, requiring greater defensive effort to suppress. The avoidant finds themselves thinking about contacting you multiple times per day, having to consciously talk themselves out of reaching out, experiencing these silent impulses as a persistent pressure that demands increasing psychological energy to resist. The effort required to maintain the silence, despite these impulses, creates an exhaustion that compounds the pressure. The pressure builds particularly intensely when the avoidant observes evidence of your life continuing and apparently thriving without them. If the avoidant sees through indirect means that you appear happy, that you are building a satisfying life, that you are engaging with others in ways that suggest you have moved beyond the relationship, this observation creates a crisis. The avoidant faces that you may have genuinely released them, that the silence from your side reflects actual indifference rather than strategic withdrawal, that waiting longer to reach out may mean missing a window where reconciliation remained possible. This recognition that the silence may be costing them permanent access to you creates pressure that threatens to overwhelm the avoidant's defensive structure. The avoidant experiences particular psychological pressure from the realization that their usual defensive strategies do not work during mutual silence. The avoidant typically manages discomfort by creating distance, yet distance already exists and is creating the discomfort rather than relieving it. The avoidant usually handles attachment anxiety by withdrawing. Yet their withdrawal has contributed to a situation that now generates anxiety. The avoidant's entire toolkit of defensive responses proves useless or counterproductive during sustained mutual silence. They cannot create distance that already exists. They cannot withdraw from a connection that has already ended. They cannot regulate through their usual patterns that require someone to be pursuing them so they can withdraw. The avoidant sits with discomfort they cannot manage through familiar mechanisms, and this inability to resolve the pressure through their usual strategies makes the pressure increasingly unbearable. The silence also creates pressure by forcing the avoidant to sit with grief and loss they typically avoid through distraction or new connections. During mutual silence with clear awareness that you are genuinely unavailable, the avoidant cannot easily distract themselves with the fantasy that reconciliation remains simple or that you still pine for them. The avoidant must face the actual loss, must experience the grief of your absence, must acknowledge that the relationship has truly ended unless they take action. They have spent their life avoiding. This forced confrontation with loss creates emotional pressure. The avoidance defensive structure exists specifically to prevent them from experiencing. The building pressure eventually creates a crisis point where the avoidant must make a conscious choice they have successfully avoided throughout their defended life. They must decide whether their attachment to you exceeds their attachment to their defended position. The sustained mutual silence eliminates the comfortable middle ground where the avoidant could maintain defenses while still having a relationship. They face a binary choice: reach out with vulnerability that risks rejection and contradicts their defended self-concept, or maintain the silence and accept the permanent loss of connection with you. The pressure of this forced choice, of having to consciously decide rather than passively allowing others' pursuit to maintain connection, creates a psychological weight that intensifies until the avoidant either breaks the silence or finds some way to definitively release you internally. Understanding the psychological pressure that builds in sustained mutual silence requires recognizing that the avoidant experiences time differently during this silence than during their typical withdrawal patterns. When the avoidant withdraws and others pursue, time feels comfortable because the avoidant knows unconsciously that connection remains available through others' effort. During mutual silence, each passing day increases pressure because each day represents potential movement toward irreversible loss. Each week makes reconciliation feel more difficult. Each month increases the likelihood that you have moved on beyond any realistic possibility of return. The avoidant experiences the silence as a countdown toward permanent loss rather than as comfortable space, and this temporal pressure builds with each day that passes without contact from either party. What the silence reveals about genuine versus performed attachment. The sustained mutual silence functions as a truth serum that exposes the reality of each person's attachment beneath their defended or pursuing presentations. Throughout the relationship, behaviors obscure genuine feelings. Your pursuit could have stemmed from authentic attachment or from anxious need for validation. The avoidance withdrawal could have reflected defended attachment or genuine lack of caring. The patterns of pursuit and withdrawal made it impossible to determine who actually cared more beneath their behavioral presentations. The mutual silence strips away these behavioral patterns and reveals truth through who can sustain the disconnection and who cannot tolerate it. The silence reveals genuine attachment through who breaks first. The person who reaches out first demonstrates that they experience the disconnection as more intolerable than the vulnerability of pursuing, that their attachment exceeds their pride or their comfort with distance, that maintaining silence costs them more than breaking it would. This breaking of silence exposes a genuine need for connection that transcends whatever defensive posturing or strategic positioning characterized their previous behavior. The person who can maintain silence indefinitely demonstrates either that their attachment was less deep than their behavior suggested, or that their defensive structure is so rigid that they will sacrifice connection rather than risk the vulnerability that reaching out would require. For the avoidant specifically, the mutual silence reveals whether their emotional unavailability reflected defended attachment or actual lack of significant feeling. The avoidant who breaks the silence after a sustained period demonstrates that beneath their defended presentation existed genuine attachment they could not acknowledge while you were pursuing them. The pressure of potentially losing you permanently overwhelms their defensive resistance to vulnerability, forcing them to reach out in ways they never did when your pursuit made reaching out unnecessary. This breaking of their defended pattern reveals that they actually cared more than their withdrawal suggested, that their unavailability was a defense rather than indifference, that losing you matters enough to override the defensive structure that governed their behavior throughout the relationship. Conversely, the avoidant who maintains sustained silence, even as months pass without contact, reveals that their attachment was insufficient to overcome their defended position. This avoidant demonstrates through their sustained silence that maintaining defended comfort matters more to them than connection with you, that whatever feeling they had for you was not deep enough to motivate the vulnerability that reaching out would require, that they can tolerate losing you more easily than they can tolerate the psychological discomfort of pursuing. The silence exposes that the avoidance attachment, while perhaps real at some level, lacks the depth or intensity that would make losing you intolerable enough to override their defenses.